This is the foundations unit and the objective, the characteristics, and the elements of democracy. Now, as we look at this objective, I want you to think of the United States democracy because from this point on, we're really going to hone down and focus just on the United States specific. So, as we look at the characteristics and elements of democracy, you have to be able to understand what the characteristics are and explain why they are important. And more importantly, can you see them in your life today? Do you see them all around you? And then what elements or conditions do we need to have to make sure our democracy continues? Because remember, one of the reasons why we study government is because we are a democracy. And a democracy is the hardest type of government there is to implement. Remember, there's a little over 200 countries in the world, and less than 10% of them are considered true democracies like the United States. And the biggest reason that is because a democracy is the most difficult type of government to implement and to keep going. And so it's your civic duty to make sure this democracy continues for yourself and for your children. So with that in mind, let's look at these characteristics of democracy. So I want to make sure you understand, and I think you do, a democracy is that system where the people have the power, we the people. So remember that. It's not the government telling the people what to do. It is the people telling the government what to do. And I think sometimes we forget that. So how do we do that? We have elected representatives who are responsible for answering to the people's will. And if those elected representatives do not answer to the people's will, then we have the power of the next election, or in some states, even recalling those elected people. So some of the characteristics of democracy that we need to think about. First of all, remember, a democracy is for the people. It is by the people. It's the democracy doing that. So a democracy is supposed to work for the people so that everybody has the same opportunities to pursue what they want to pursue according to their abilities. So that is one of the positives of a democracy. Everybody has that equality of opportunity. Now, in a democracy, it is ruled by the people, which means there is majority rule. And so we get that majority rule by having our elections. So we have our representation in this republic to vote for us. Now, as you have seen through history, sometimes the minority voices aren't always heard, and they're not heard immediately. That is the beauty of how our democracy continues to evolve and develop, because any democracy with all people choosing how the government will act, that's majority rule. And eventually that minority right will come through. Sometimes it takes time. It's not always perfect. Remember, our Constitution says in order to form a more perfect union, not perfect, but as close as you can get for a government. So when we look at these characteristics, we have to have free and open elections. Every citizen has the right to vote, and every citizen's vote has equal weight, and you can freely express those views. Thank you, First Amendment. How our system works is we do have political parties. Now, our Constitution wasn't written for political parties. In fact, James Madison, who wrote the Constitution, believed that the Constitution was written in such a way that political parties would not exist. But that is how our system has evolved over time, where our candidates are vetted through the political party process. And so the political party, via freedom of speech, has the power to have opposition. And we see that all the time in our system. And probably that's one of the reasons why people do not like politics, is because they see the conflict. I would say to you, if you don't have conflict, you don't have a democracy. If there's no conflict, you have a dictatorship or a monarchy, an autocracy, or even an oligarchy. We don't want that. You need to have conflict because that means people are being able to express their opposing views and being able to discuss them to figure out what is best for the majority as we move forward as a country. So conflict is essential for a strong, functioning democracy. So when we look at these characteristics of democracy, when you think about the United States as democracy, one of the things everybody says is there's the freedom. And I think probably you've experienced having freedoms taken away living through COVID-19. Now, we can have that debate of whether that was warranted or not warranted, but you understand more what that looks like. Your assembly laws, right to gather, right to have your own livelihood, to provide for your family. Those kind of things came into discussion as we looked at what freedom means in a democracy in America. But one of the things that everybody talks about with immigrants is I come to America because it's freedom. There is freedom here, freedom to pursue your dreams, that pursuit of happiness, freedom to have property, whatever it is going to be, but freedom in so many ways. Freedom to get married when you're 18, freedom to not get married, freedom to get married when you're 28, whatever it's going to be. But that freedom is an essential aspect, characteristic of American democracy. Equality of opportunity. Right? We all have the same opportunities. Doesn't mean we're going to have the same results. Doesn't mean we have the same ends, but that's because of the freedom of what you do with it. But you all have the same equality of opportunity. Doesn't mean it's perfect, almost perfect, right? But there is that equality of opportunity. Talked about majority rule with minority rights. That's the main integral characteristic of the system. One of the things we haven't talked about too much is the necessity for compromise. And this is one of the things that I fear is probably plaguing the United States the most with our political processes. People have forgotten about compromise. You have to compromise, otherwise the democracy cannot move forward. There has to be some give and take. Think about all the compromises in our history. The 3/5 compromise, the compromise in how we created Congress between the large states and the small states, with the Virginia plan versus the New Jersey plan, and coming up with our unique Congress and how we put it together. There was compromise in the military with the don't ask, don't tell policy and homosexuality. There is compromise all the time. But my fear is we're seeing less and less compromise. And you have to understand you cannot have a democracy unless there is compromise. Compromise has to be a component, and we have to learn how to compromise and have some of that give and take. Individual worth and value. We believe every single person has worth and value in the United States. Think about our educational system. Think about the people who are in our school with us. We educate everybody. There are some nations that don't educate everybody. We educate everybody with marginal intellectual abilities to gifted intellectual abilities because we believe every single person has value. I see this in our military because our military doesn't have suicide plans. Our military doesn't have suicide missions. No, our military says, hey, this might be a tough mission, but there's always an exit strategy. We always have a plan to come back home. And even our wounded and dead, no man left behind or woman, but we don't leave people behind because we believe every single person has worth and value. That's part of our American democracy. That's a characteristic. And because we believe every single person has worth and value, the United States has policies to show that and to make sure that we provide that freedom, equality, rights for everybody because everybody has worth and value. The last thing is the social consensus of democratic values. Democracy is the hardest type of government to run. And you need to understand this because if we don't agree on certain aspects, like, yeah, we have to debate. Yeah, we have to argue. Yeah, there's going to be conflict. Geez, it takes a long time to pass laws. Why are the political parties always fighting? Well, that's how democracy works. If it doesn't have that, like I said, it's a dictatorship and your rights may not be guaranteed at that point. Now, there's different elements of democracy that we need to talk about in order for a democracy to prosper and to continue to grow. And so there's certain things that must be part of a democratic nation, otherwise the democracy will not flourish. So one of the things why we do citizenship duties, CDs, is because if you do not have a full participatory civic life, we are going to lose our democracy. people have to be engaged. Now, it doesn't mean you just vote. That is a part of your democracy and keeping it alive. But it also means serving in your community. It also means being aware of the current events in the news. It also means right to petition, which means writing letters to your representatives and your lawmakers. There's so many different facets of what it is to be a citizen to keep this democracy going. And so that's why we do citizenship duties, because if you don't do some of those things, this democracy will die. And I don't want this democracy to die. That's why this class is required, because we want to keep this democracy going. You got to have a middle class in a democracy. And that's why we're worried about economy as one of those purposes of government. If you don't have a strong middle class, if you don't have that aspect to your society, your democracy will wither away. And then it becomes the haves versus the have-nots. And that haves becomes an oligarchy of the wealthy and the elite controlling the poor that work just for the haves. And so we do not want that. We want to have a middle class. We want to have the pursuit of property and those property rights, whatever it's going to be, spread throughout our system. That's what keeps a strong and healthy democracy. Also, the reason why you're here in a free public school system is to promote democracy. So you understand what your rights are. So you understand how the system works. So you understand what your civic duties are. So you understand how to participate in the workforce and develop your skills and develop your gifts and develop your passions. That's why we have a free public school system open to all. Also, again, people have to accept democratic values. You have to believe in individual liberty. You need to believe that, yeah, people have the right to be stupid and do stupid things. That's freedom. People have the right to pursue whatever and take those risks, but with risks come failure. Do you believe people should have the right to fail and have to deal with the consequences of failure? Or do you want government telling you, yes, you can do this, no, you can't do this, because we don't want to deal with your failure? You need to think about what those democratic values are. And those democratic values, individual liberty, life, you have the right to your individual life, your property, pursue what you want to do, right? So that freedom to make great decisions and not so great decisions. But when you make not so great decisions, you got to deal with the consequences. So these are some of those democratic values. Individual liberty and what that means is so important for elements of a democracy. You also have to have a lot of voluntary organizations in a democracy, which really scares me, because civic participation in a lot of these voluntary organizations is significantly decreasing in the United States. Now, these can be different economic groups, religious groups, lots of different things. Your Rotarians, your Kiwanis, Key Club is a voluntary organization, a student senate. Those type of things are all elements of our democracy that you have to have with volunteers keeping your community going. Otherwise, your community will collapse. And so that's why we do community service as an option for citizenship duties. So these voluntary organizations are independent of government, and they are what help a government or a democracy to flourish. Because if you didn't have those, who would be providing these networks and safety? Who would be paying for some of these little league programs and doing this kind of stuff? That volunteer organization is important as well. And that's another reason why we have that as part of our citizenship duties. So this is a quick list of those elements of democracy. I summarized those for you. We're not doing the group aspect to this, but I think that will help you understand the characteristics of democracy and the elements of democracy. Like always, make sure you put these in your notes, review, and the most important aspect here is, can you identify these characteristics of democracy? Can you identify these elements of democracy around you today in your everyday life in 20 or during this time?